For the Life of the World is a production of the Yale Center for Faith and Culture. Visit us online at faith.yale.edu.
To look to those communities that are the most deprived of flourishing and see how they relate to Christ and how they relate that to a God of life or a God of flourishing, if that makes sense. You can actually be, at least according to Christian thought, the only sinless person in human history, and you can still be tortured and crucified in your early 30s.
This is For the Life of the World, a podcast about seeking and living a life worthy of our humanity. I'm Evan Rosa with the Yale Center for Faith and Culture. Hello, friends. Help me make sense of this for a minute. From the perspective of Christian theology, it's probably not going too far to say that both the moral exemplarity and the suffering life of Jesus should be central to the Christian understanding of flourishing. Here's another way to put it. Jesus was morally perfect, sinless, but encountered immense suffering, poverty, marginalization, oppression, eventual torture, and death. He was tempted, yet without sin, but also counted among the sinners, according to Isaiah 53's suffering servant theme. He's acquainted with grief, familiar with sorrow, anguished in his soul. And so the big question here is, what kind of flourishing do we envision when we follow Christ toward that flourishing? Today, we're sharing a conversation between Matt Crosman and Katie Grimes, assistant professor of theological ethics at Villanova University. Together, they discuss the social context of theology, trying to make sense of the role of Christ in approaching theology from the perspective of flourishing. For Katie, thinking about flourishing means thinking about virtues and vices, and that means thinking about the habits that pull us along toward the fully realized human good. But it also means pursuing a theological vision that accounts for the most troubling of social realities. Thanks for listening today.
Katie, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
If you meet someone and they ask you what you do for a living, what answer do you give them, and what kind of conversation do you end up having?
Well, I have to admit that sometimes I dread that question just because you don't know where people are coming from, how what I say might come across. So, I'm honest. I usually start by saying, I teach. Where do you teach? I teach at a college. And I say I teach theology. Some people aren't quite sure what that is, so I say it's kind of like teaching religion, but kind of from an insider's perspective. And then I say, but, it's not so much about indoctrinating people. It's about kind of teaching them about the faith and how to think critically. So, you kind of have to gauge where the person's coming from, because some people aren't sure about what theology could possibly mean as an academic discipline. And I kind of just see where the person I'm talking to takes it. Sometimes they want to share their opinions on religion or God. I kind of just follow their lead, and I don't particularly have any particular agenda. I just take it kind of just any conversation. Because sometimes people have a genuine question or something that they, maybe an experience they want to get off their chest. And so I kind of let them lead and maybe kind of take it more, I guess, as more like a chaplain or some kind of just seeing where they want to go. So.
First of all, I relate to that entirely. These big questions about what is theology, what is it for? So many of these questions, I guess one thing, theology is it's contextual, right? It has to do with people and their environments and their cultures and their experiences. And when you meet, that's the whole thing of meeting a stranger. You don't know what their culture is.
Yeah, exactly.
Why don't we start on the positive side?
Okay.
Let's start on the plus side. As you look at theology, what do we have to be grateful for in theology? What's going well? What's right with theology these days?
That's a broad and hard question. I think maybe first to start, I think what's going right in theology is teaching. I think is just, professors in all different types of institutions across the theological and political spectrum, I think just concern and care for teaching and those kind of just relationships and encounters. I think that's probably what we can most hang our hat on. But I guess from the research side, I think a lot of the work being done by scholars of color, I think, is certainly the academy is still disproportionately white, and white people have disproportionate power. But I think people of color are paving a way for themselves. And I think that is probably, maybe one of the most hopeful things that's going right in theology that maybe had been going less right in the past. Still needs to go more right, but it's on the way, I think.
Well, so maybe that's one of the answers then for our next question, which is what gives you pause, or what should be concerning us in terms of the state of theology at the moment?
I mean, from a structural side, I know some institutions are struggling financially. We live in a finite world. We're not just sui generis. I think that's a little concerning. Kind of a lot of institutions are trying to figure out how do we live in this new kind of economic reality with technology. But I think just the things that give me the most pause, it's kind of the flip side of the things I'm the most excited about. I think the academy, the university, we're in a society, right? So for the most part, we're going to reflect both the strengths and weaknesses, right, or the virtues and vices, you could say, of our surrounding culture. And a lot of the structural injustices, particularly racism or white supremacy, it's reflected not just in the university, but in the academy. And I think certainly there is energy within, there is energy among theologians to combat that, right? But it's not something that people in a department can do just by being conscious, right? It's going to require kind of really intense, widespread structural change. And so I think trying to resist the vices that we all come into from our culture, I think that's probably the thing that gives me the most pause.
So that puts so I hear you talking a lot about kind of institutional context, social context. Mm-hmm. Does that mean that our theological task doesn't just end with our teaching and our writing? Do we have responsibilities for building certain sorts of institutions? Is that how you would think about that?
Yeah, I mean, my colleague Jerry Beyer is very concerned with kind of structural justice in the university from an economic lens. My mentor, James Keenan, just wrote a book on university ethics. I do think all facets, not just racism, I do think we have an obligation to attend to kind of the structural justice within the university. I mean, not just within the university, but the way the university is acting in society. If that makes sense.
Yeah. So Miroslav and I proposed that theology could be helped by thinking more about flourishing human life. And it seemed to us that, if we're going to be writing and thinking about that, then we have some responsibilities to advocate and to work for the possibility of the flourishing of the lives of other humans around us and these sorts of things. How does that strike you, that kind of proposal to say, let's talk flourishing human lives? This is a thing that theology ought to be about articulating.
I think it's a great place to start. I mean, as I said in my paper, I'm a little biased because I did grow up Catholic, heavily influenced by kind of a Thomistic mindset. But yeah, I think flourishing is a great place to start. And again, with flourishing, right, flourishing, it does require a certain kind of intellectual disposition. But also, again, flourishing is also, it's not just something people do individually or even not even in their communities, right? Even communities are within structures, right? I think along with that, it's not the only thing we need to do. But again, we're concerned about flourishing. We should be concerned about the things that impede flourishing, especially those things that might be outside of an individual or a community's control. Yeah. So and this is all of my questions are genuine. This is one that I puzzle over a lot. So there can be in a kind of struggle to right injustices in our world, to resist kind of continued systemic injustice. It can seem like the focus, rightly, presumably some degree of focus needs to be on what's wrong. We need to keep our eyes on what's inhibiting the flourishing of human beings. What role is there for a kind of positive vision of human flourishing? Is it simply the sum total of removing all the inhibitors and it sort of naturally happens on its own? Or is there, you see the question? Or is there a kind of a positive task of articulation that's presumably goes hand in hand with the negative work, but is still somehow a different sort of task or a complementary sort of task? Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really important question. I think for me, I think the negative and the positive are intertwined. So if we're thinking about flourishing, at least for me, we're also thinking about virtue and vice habits. And we do a bunch of different metaphors: learning to play an instrument, learning to play sports, recovering from a drug or alcohol addiction. We can kind of know, we're like, well, I kind of know what it sounds like to play the violin well or to be good at basketball during the NBA finals. So I'm going to bring up basketball, right? Or I kind of know what it would be like to not be dependent on a certain drug. But at the same time, the kind of actual intellectual knowledge of what that positive state of flourishing looks like, it's kind of something you discover through the living of it or through the building of the habit, right? And so I kind of see them as intertwined. I mean, we kind of have a sense of what it looks like to be a great basketball player, right? But for example, LeBron James, he would have grown up dreaming about being the greatest of all time, but he doesn't actually know what that was going to look like until he got there. And so it's kind of along the way. I mean, it's, Liberation Theology has done a good job with the praxis and reflection. I mean, it's kind of similar with building habits. So to me, I see them as dependent, right? And it may be that when we're starting along the way to flourishing, all we may know for sure is that this is bad. right? So if we stop this or avoid this, right, then a new way of life opens up, kind of, but only after that, if that makes sense. That's kind of how I see it.
So there isn't an ideal drawing us forward.
I mean,
or we may not be aware of it.
Well, there's something there. I mean, I don't want to say there's no sense, but, it's kind of hazy. And I think the closer we are along the parts of habituation that are closer to us, that we're closer to realizing are much clearer, right? So, okay, we know what it looks like to be addicted to alcohol, right? Okay, so now I'm maybe less addicted to alcohol, right? And now, okay, I see a new step, a new goal, right? If that makes sense. Not that we have no sense, right? But it can only really become, I think, super clear as we're getting there.
How do you see within the Christian tradition, how do you see the role of the life of Christ? And is the one answer would be, well, of course there's an ideal. We have better than LeBron James. We have right. We have the life of Jesus.
I mean, obviously people spend like their lifetimes on how does discipleship or the life of Christ relate to ethics. But I guess what I would say is I don't know. I mean, I think that Jesus Christ is important for any theology, obviously, or any Christian theology, obviously, but I'm not so sure that Jesus himself is a model of flourishing. I think you've seen from womanist theologies or liberation theology, James Cone, cross the lynching tree. I think a lot of people have said that perhaps part of the meaning of the incarnation was some sort of intentional, Jesus choosing or allowing himself to be deprived full flourishing. And then the trick is to see how Jesus was denied flourishing. And that was part of the point, right? It was part of the revelation of what it means to be fully divine and fully human in a broken world. But without that then meaning that God then wants us to not have flourishing, right? And so it can get very tricky. And so, again, I would just say, I think the best way out of that is to look to those communities that are the most deprived of flourishing and see how they relate to Christ and how they relate that to a God of life or a God of flourishing, if that makes sense. But no, I don't think Jesus is necessarily like a spiritual LeBron James. Or, well, no, let me take that back. He is a spiritual LeBron James, but he's not like, this is the perfect, he had the best, most flourishing life, right? I mean, a morally perfect life, right? But not necessarily a flourishing life, which again, that's, if we're looking just a straight like Aristotelian, that's supposed to not be possible, right? If you're morally perfect, your life is supposed to be awesome, right? And I think Jesus' life himself shows that's just not true. You can actually be, at least according to Christian thought, the only sinless person in human history, and you can still be tortured and crucified in your early 30s.
Yeah, and you can go the Stoic route and say, no, he was happy in crucifixion because he had placed his happiness in his own moral virtue, and it was never plainer than when he was on the cross. But that seems pretty hard to read in the Christian tradition. Do we then have to look to the life of the enthroned Christ?
What do you mean? What do you mean by that?
To think about kind of eschatological Christ, the Christ of the world of perfect love, our ideal flourishing human life?
I'm not quite familiar with that language, but I would say we don't have as much access, intellectual access. We don't necessarily, I think, have a lot of knowledge content-wise about, well, what does that Jesus in heaven look like, or the eschatological, the ascended Jesus. So that's, I guess, what I would say.
Back into an imaginative process of trying to have some sort of trajectory that's the essence of who Christ is, hasn't changed from his life in Nazareth, but there is some sort of...
And something I think that's recently I've been kind of meditating on and thinking about both spiritually and theologically is even Jesus, when he was resurrected during his earthly resurrected life, he still had his wounds from the cross. And I mean, it's a very subtle thing, but I think there's actually something very profound about that. Maybe the way that God heals in history, right? Jesus, his wounds weren't taken away. They were turned into something different, but, they were still there. The wounds on the cross that obviously were violations and killed him, we see that's touched them in the resurrected life, and they become kind of vehicles for recognition and intimacy, right? I think that's an interesting way of thinking about maybe the way the kind of deprivations of flourishing in history might get reconciled eschatologically.
One of the things we're trying to think about in this particular conversation, we're trying to think a bit about our kind of pluralistic context. It seems like, well, that's significant for then how we do theology and how we think about theology. And especially when we're thinking about some of the kinds of problems that you're pointing us to, these are, to be sure, problems in the church. though not only problems in the church, they extend beyond it. And it immediately seems to me that theology in the way that you're talking about it then kind of automatically has a broader public in mind than just the church and just those who would share your convictions. What does theology have to say to a kind of broad pluralistic context? How do we speak across that what can feel like maybe a divide between church and world?
This could be because I'm an ethicist, right? But for me, I think it's less how do we speak to the pluralistic context and how do we speak in it? I mean, I guess I'm kind of very formed by Gaudium et Spes, which was a document on the Second Vatican Council, right? A kind of openness to the world, right? Truth, I mean, again, a Thomistic insight, all truth is one. Truth can come from many different sources. So being open to that and being willing to learn from that. And personally, I mean, issues I write about, hey, who wouldn't love everybody to be like, oh my gosh, your book, you've solved all the problems, right? Of course. But I think we should, I think I think really our only audience really should be, maybe not our only audience, but really we should mostly concern ourselves with speaking, if not to the church, to other Christians. I mean, I think there's plenty, it's not like there's not enough work there. And I mean, and again, certainly colleagues that do interreligious dialogue or that is tremendously important, not just kind of ethically or socially, but theologically, right? So I'm not trying to poo that or anything, but I just think there's enough work for us to speak to. I mean, if we are theologians, I think that's our primarily task is speaking to other Christians, talking with non-Christians, learning from them. Right. And if they want to learn from us, great. Right. That's just kind of, that could just be my kind of personal vocation. I don't know if that's a universal thing, but.
That seems super, super important. At the very least, the conversation, it has to be a conversation.
Right.
That learning happens on both sides. Communication runs in both directions. No, that's really helpful. All right. Well, one final question. We've talked about what's going well. We've talked about what maybe is cause for concern. Where would you have us look for hope for theology's future? Yeah, where should we be looking to say like, I can see there's a good sign there. We're headed in the right direction.
This hope question is a tricky question, right? Because we don't want hope to be optimism, but at the same time, it has to be something, right? So looking for hope in history is always tricky. Precisely the dynamic between divine and human agency is hard to know sometimes who's pulling the strings. I mean, besides the things that I've said I think are going well, which you could say that's reason for hope, and I wouldn't deny it is, but I think if we're talking hope, we always have to take an eschatological mindset and have a certain, I think we have to do kind of a balance act. We have to have a kind of a detachment. We have to have a detachment from outcome in the sense that it won't diminish our desire to keep working or to keep trying to live in accordance with God's will or working for justice, but we can't lean on that. That can't be the reason why we live a certain way. So I guess just hope for anything, right? I kind of take the eschatological mindset that if we do our part, God will do God's part. And then hope is also a certain sense of trust that things will work out. Again, like with the virtue thing, we can't quite see how this whole thing's going to play out, but we trust and hope that it will.
Theology's hope ultimately has to be in God.
Yeah,
God's
exactly.
agency.
Exactly.
For the Life of the World is a production of the Yale Center for Faith and Culture at Yale Divinity School. This episode featured theological ethicist Katie Grimes and biblical scholar Matt Crosman. I'm Evan Rosa, and I edit and produce the show. For more information, visit us online at faith.yale.edu. New episodes drop every Saturday, sometimes midweek. If you're new to the show, welcome, friend. Hit subscribe in your favorite podcast listening app, and we'd love your feedback. Ratings and reviews in Apple Podcasts are particularly helpful, but we're just as happy to hear from you by email at faith@yale.edu. We read each comment and do our best to respond and improve the show, bringing you the people and topics that you want to hear. And if you're a regular listener, it's a huge honor that you stick with us from week to week. So I'll ask you to step up and join us. Help us share the show. Behind those 3 dots in your podcast app, there's an option to share this episode by text or email or social media. If you took a brief moment to send your favorite episode to a friend or share with the world, not only would you be supporting the show, you'd be sparking up a great conversation around stuff that matters with people that matter. Thanks for listening today, friends. We'll be back with more this coming week.